Time to create our first CSS grid. You can turn any HTML element into a grid container by setting its display property to grid. So we have this HTML element container, and then here is the CSS for that. We are going to set the display property to grid, and this will give us the ability to use the other properties associated with CSS Grid. So I'm just going to put display grid, and we're done. So it doesn't do anything quite yet because we haven't updated any of the other properties yet, but we'll do that in later challenges. Now we need to start defining the structure of the grid. We'll start with adding some columns using grid template columns. So I'm going to do that now and show you how to solve this challenge. I'm going to type in grid template columns, and after grid template columns, we're going to put the width of each column. So the number of numbers we put here are the number of columns. We're going to have 3 columns, so we're going to have 3 numbers, and all of them are going to be 100 pixels wide. So I just have to put 100 pixels 3 times. And now, if I refresh the page here, you'll see that we have 3 columns. So here we have grid template columns, which we already learned about, which sets the number of columns. Now we want to set the exact number of rows. Right now the rows are just determined automatically, but if we know exactly how many rows we want, we can use grid template rows. So to solve this challenge, we just have to add grid template rows, and then just like grid template columns, the number of numbers are the number of rows. And each number is how tall each one will be. So I'm going to put um, 50 pixels, 50 pixels. So we'll have 2 rows that are each 50 pixels high. So if I refresh that, it looks pretty similar because that was very close to what the default was, but we just solved it. You can use CSS grid units to change the size of columns and rows. You can use pixels and ems, but you can also use things like FR, which sets the column or row to a fraction of the available space. See this, how we have 5 different columns and they're all different sizes? Well, we have this code here. So you can see the first column is auto. That's the one here. And that sets the column to the size of the space. So it is just big enough for that one to fit in there. And then the second column is 50. So this column with the 2 is 50 pixels wide. With the 3, we have 10%. So this 3 is 10% of the available section from the whole container. This is 3% of the whole container. And now we have the 2 FR and 1 FR. That's columns 4 and 5. So the last 2 columns, the remaining space is divided into 3 sections because 2 plus 1 is 3. 2 of the sections are allocated to the 4th column and 1 to the 5th column. We're going to make a grid with 3 columns. Instead of all 5 of these, we're going to specify 3 of them. So the first one is going to be 1 FR. and then we're going to have 100 pixels, and then 2FR. So let's see what that looks like when I refresh the page here. So we can see we have 3 columns. The middle column is always staying at 100 pixels, no matter how wide, but the first and third column will change because of the FR units here. You can see here in these columns, there's no gap between the columns. They just butt up right against each other. Sometimes you want a gap between the columns, so you use grid column gap. I'm going to show you how to do that right now and show you how to solve this challenge. So it's going to be grid column gap, and then we set how many pixels we want in between each column. In this case, we're going to put 20 pixels. So if I refresh here, we should see space in between each column. In the last challenge, we learned about grid column gap. You probably won't be surprised to learn that there's also a grid row gap. So it works just the same. We'll put grid row gap, and it'll make a gap between the rows. In this case, we'll put 5 pixels. If I refresh here, you can see that there's a space in between the rows here. The grid gap property is a shorthand property for using the grid row gap and grid column gap properties all at once. If you just put one number, it will put the same gap on the rows and columns. If you use two numbers, the first number will be rows, the second number will be columns. So I'm going to just do the two numbers here. So I'm going to do grid gap, and then the first number is going to be 10 pixels for the rows, and the second number is going to be 20 pixels for the columns. If I refresh this here, we can see that there's the 10 pixels in between, and then there's the 20 pixels for the columns here. The grid column property is used to set how many columns a grid item will take up. Now here's a 3 by 3 grid, and there's these hypothetical lines that you don't see, but they exist in between the grids, and they're numbered 1. You can see in this example for a 3 by 3 grids, there's 4 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4. So for the grid column property, to set how many columns an item is going to take up, you're going to specify the beginning line and the ending line. So if you wanted to take up 2 columns, the first 2 columns, you would specify line 1 and then line 3, because it would start at line 1 and it would end at line 3. Let me show you what that would look like. So for instance, if we were going to set this item 5 to take up the first 2 columns, it would be like this: grid column, and then we would put 1/3, because it would start at the first line and end at the third line. For this challenge, though, we are going to make the grid take up the final 2 columns. So it's going to start at 2 and end at 4. So if we refresh that, we should see that this fifth element starts at 2 and then it ends at 4, just like that. We learned how to make grid items consume multiple columns. We can also do the same thing with rows. It's basically the same thing. So instead of grid column, it's going to be grid row. And then for this challenge, we have to make it take up the last two rows. So the same as before. I'm going to put 2/4 because if you look on the diagram, the last two rows are these two rows, and it's going to start at the 2 line and end at the 4 line. So let's refresh the page here, and you'll see that it's taking up the last two rows of this section here.